CNBC, and it took me 45 minutes to get from Englewood to the bridge, not over the bridge. So everyone just stuck here. I guess I should have printed this out a little bit larger.
Need my glasses?
You don't even need to look at the bottom.
I know, I could just talk about you. I love you so much. That is true. You ready to go?
Yeah,
Let's start. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for those of you who are watching via the web. I want to especially thank our straight friends and allied supporters who are here, so appreciate that. I'm here to introduce our speaker. I'm Jill Schlesinger. I work at CBS Interactive at moneywatch.com. Please click on my blog as many times as possible. And it's very good for me. And follow me at Jill on Money. I'm here to introduce Kate Kendell, who is the Executive Director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. NCLR is a national legal organization committed to advancing the civil and human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and their families through litigation, public policy, advocacy, and public education. Through direct litigation and advocacy, NCLR works to change discriminatory laws and to create new laws and policies benefiting the LGBT community. So what you may not know about NCLR is that the organization fought the marriage case and won in California before Prop 8 Boo Hiss came along, and so we should put that out there. And let me give you some other interesting factoids about Kate Kendell, who I met about 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm on the advisory board at NCLR, and so I've gotten to know Kate pretty well. Kate grew up as a Mormon in Utah. Let's just have that for a moment. Let's just give a moment for that.
Just feel bad for Kate.
No, I don't say feel bad, but just sort of like let that permeate whatever you think is like the hard thing in your life. And she
for multiple wives.
There you go. Right, exactly. Had I known, it's like big love, the big lesbian love is what they should have done a series, right? There you go. Gwen, get that on Showtime immediately. She received a JD from the University of Utah College of Law and practiced some corporate law, and then maybe not so much, didn't like the corporate law that much. And she pursued her real love, which is civil rights advocacy. She became the first staff attorney for the ACLU of Utah, and she directly litigated many high-profile cases. And you know, listen, this is what I can tell you about Kate. I'm going to stop talking because she's a wonderful speaker, and she is here with my dear friend Chris Hermans, and they do amazing work at NCLR, and you are going to be able to ask her great questions. And without further ado, Ms. Kate Kendell.
Well, thank you so much. I am very happy to be here and happy to stand at this formal podium because I want other people to be able to see this as well. Usually I'd be out roving around a bit. I love doing this kind of stuff, talking to people in small groups. I love that this group has just gotten started here at CBS, and I appreciate the fact that folks, you know, could have been anywhere else tonight and are willing to be here to hear a little bit about the work that NCLR does. I think most people here probably don't know much about NCLR, so I kind of want to rewind the tape a bit. I've been at NCLR as executive director for about 15 years. We're about 33 years old. And, you know, so obviously 15 years is the lifetime of everyone here. As I look around, I think actually 33 years probably is too. And so you, as much as anyone, are able to chart the progress that we've made in what really by historic times, by civil rights, in civil rights time, is the blink of an eye. We have completely seen the landscape change when it comes to LGBT issues. And NCLR has been, in many ways, at the forefront of many of these gains. Back 30 years ago in 1977, when we were founded as the Lesbian Rights Project. And the reason we were founded is that at that time there were very few LGBT organizations. In fact, none of them doing any really T work, no one doing any real trans work. That wasn't something that was even a part of our own movement consciousness. But the groups that did exist were focused on two things. Believe it or not, the military, trying to change the military so that openly gay service members could serve, and lesbians, and sodomy reform, getting rid of laws that criminalized same-sex sexual intimacy. And while those are two very important things, and obviously Lambda Legal in their case, Lawrence versus Texas, saw the end to laws that criminalize same-sex sexual intimacy, and we're still fighting don't ask, don't tell. So these are still enormously important issues, and we're enormously important to fight for. The fact is, the issues mainly affecting lesbians were not being paid attention to by really anyone. And those issues were primarily lesbians coming out of heterosexual marriages and losing custody of their children based on sexual orientation. So in the 70s, you think about where we were as a movement. And some of you who identify as LGBT may have previously been in heterosexual marriages. That often was just what you did, even if you knew that something wasn't right about that. Even if you actually knew that your attraction was not to someone of the opposite sex. What did you do in the 60s and 70s and 80s? Well, you got married anyway to someone of the opposite sex because there was no viable visibility or avenue for one having a full life, embraced by your family, embraced by the culture, supported by your community, unless that's what you did. And so many gay men and lesbians got married, had children, and then came to a recognition that this is not right for me. This is not who I am, and I can't live like this. So they divorced, and their spouses, 9 times out of 10, during that time, would sue them for custody. So NCLR was founded because we heard stories, the women who founded NCLR heard stories again and again about women losing custody of their kids. But who else was losing custody? Gay men. And within the first 2 years of NCLR's founding, we were representing our first HIV-positive gay dad who lost custody of his daughter to his ex-wife, who was part of an evangelical, far-right religious cult. There's no other word to describe it. They were. Took the daughter to Texas, swore that her ex-husband would never see the child again. We, at that time, had 2 staff and a budget of $22,000 a year. And we represented, we represented Artie Wallace in fighting for custody of his daughter in California. And believe it or not, we won. Custody was returned to our client Artie, and he raised his girl until his death, which was not that long after that. Obviously, this was a time in the early 1980s when there wasn't any of the attention that there needed to be to HIV. And the daughter ended up being raised to adulthood by Artie's partner at the time. Now, that story is a typical story of the work that we do. And recognizing that there is an issue that's not being addressed and finding ways to address it. And it wasn't just family law issues, although those have always been sort of core bread and butter issues for NCLR. We were always doing family law work. We were always doing employment work. We were doing work very soon after our founding on behalf of LGBT youth. And it wasn't just, obviously, about lesbians. Now we're the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and what that mainly is about animating is lesbian leadership and still a focus on issues that affect women and lesbians, but with a very deep understanding that all this is connected. We win that case for Artie Wallace. We help every lesbian, whoever is going to be involved in a custody fight. We win a case on behalf of a transgender dad in Florida, which we did 8 years ago after a 3-week trial. A transgender dad won custody back of his children. We have made that landscape safer in Florida for lesbian and gay parents. The work we do on immigration, we were one of the first national organizations to have an immigration project to make it possible for people persecuted in home countries to come to the United States, seek asylum, and have safety and security. When we win those cases, we make this a more embracing culture for all LGBT people. So there's always been this sense of what issues are not being addressed and how can we address those? Who's being left behind as we think about the gains that we're making? So 15 years ago, in 1994, I started at NCLR as legal director, and a year later became executive director. And just in that, even from the time we were founded to the time I started, it was incredible the gains we've made. But even in 1994, the calls that we mostly dealt with day in and day out were people who had lost their jobs simply based on the fact that they had come out or were found out to be lesbian or gay, or still hearing from men and women losing custody of their kids coming out of heterosexual marriages. And in that short 15 years, we've completely transformed that. Now, obviously, in most states in this country, you can still lose your job simply based on sexual orientation, which is why we've been pushing so hard for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. But corporations, and you all know this as well as I do, have led the way when government wouldn't. So we see protections at the municipal level, and we see protections in businesses because it's a best practices to not discriminate based on obviously race, class, sexual orientation, and increasingly gender identity. So in some ways, where the legal system hasn't been as far along as it's needed to, or where government hasn't been as far along as it's needed to, it's been individuals advocating within their own corporations to get changes made. When I made the decision to be a lawyer, I was really young. And obviously, my life took lots of twists and turns between thinking I wanted to be a lawyer and actually having it happen. My family was not a family that focused on education. I don't remember ever seeing my dad, for example, reading a book. I was the first member of my generation to go to college or go to law school. When I told my dad I was going to go to law school, he said, "Oh, so you're going to be a professional student." So obviously there wasn't like a whole lot of support for continuing education. But I remember in being a senior in high school and our English teacher reading us To Kill a Mockingbird. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be Atticus. That's what I'm going to do. You know, obviously I set my sights very low, and you know, but I really believed. And then I started reading a lot more about the law and a lot more about what lawyers do. And I really believed that law was a force for positive social change. I mean, I had teachers when I was in junior high, especially this one super radical teacher. I mean, imagine Ogden, Utah. Yes, it's like as white and homogeneous as you could possibly imagine. And I had this history teacher exposing me to Sojourner Truth, Nat Turner, Chief Joseph. And those writings really made me realize the importance of rebellion in social change and also the importance of law. And yet by the time I finally got out of law school, things had changed markedly. It was no longer the Warren Court. We're now dealing with the Rehnquist Court and a complete retrenchment when it came to courts really being at the forefront of social change. We weren't seeing cases like Gideon versus Wainwright that said, look, you have to provide proper care in terms of the criminal justice system, or Brown versus Board of Education. You know, we were seeing much more retrograde rulings from the court. And yet, at the same time, we were still seeing progress being made. And it was sort of hoping against hope that courts would once again find their voice and be at the forefront. And so through where we've gained most of our ground since I've been at NCLR has not really been from the federal government or even from the federal courts, with some notable exceptions. Obviously, Loving versus Virginia, Romer versus Evans from the U.S. Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court is not a place where we would normally look to see positive gains. Our gains have really been in state courts, case by case, sometimes county judge by county judge. That's how we've entirely changed the landscape when it comes to custody, how it's changed when it comes to adoption law, how it's changed when it comes to youth rights and bullying and protecting kids in schools. And then we get to this year. This year has been nothing short of extraordinary when we think about what courts have done. And I feel that almost my entire legal life has been leading to a moment where you actually see courts once again at the forefront of protecting individual rights and liberties. So this spring, the U.S. Supreme Court, in 2 key rulings, made a huge difference in the lives of LGBT people, and yet these weren't really seen as gay cases. The first was a case out of Washington State. You may remember that there was a measure on the ballot in Washington State to repeal, of all things, domestic partner protections. So when the far right says, oh, it's just marriage that concerns us, we are happy with couples having domestic partner protections or civil unions, it's just marriage. That is a bald-faced lie. Because anywhere we get civil union or domestic partner protections, they challenge those immediately. And they did that in Washington State after domestic partner protections went through the Washington State legislature. And then, when they lost at the ballot box by a very narrow margin, really too close for comfort, they sued to not have their names revealed to the public on the petitions that they'd signed. So, thankfully, in a 9-0 ruling, the Supreme Court and even Justice Scalia agreed that the process that Washington State adopted for every other proposition was that your names were public. And what Scalia essentially said is, if you don't have the civic courage to stand behind your vote and your belief about what a particular proposition should say or what a policy should be in a state, then don't sign the effing petition. Now, he didn't really say that part, but you get the point. I mean, he made clear that that open government was very, very important. And the reason this is such an important case in terms of gay people is that the justification for not having these names released by the proponents of this anti-gay measure was because marauding gay people were going to make their life miserable. And they were going to be open to gay harassment anti-gay harassment based on their anti-gay beliefs from the gay community. Now, of course, this is all just poppycock. I mean, there's just no justification, there's no factual basis or support for that ever. None of our organizations, none of our community would at all support open harassment or violence against people who hold anti-gay views. You know, occasionally, I mean, during the Prop 8 campaign, some churches were defaced. That was completely denounced and should be denounced. So we know this is just utterly ridiculous. But Justice Thomas actually would have ruled the other way in this case. So it's not as if it's a fait accompli that you can't have people believe that they need to be protected from gay people and thereby shut down the open government that Washington State was advocating for. So thankfully, we won that case. And then, of course, you all know that DOMA was struck down in Boston, our colleagues at Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, by a federal judge in Boston, striking down Section B of DOMA, which is really the most, I mean, DOMA overall, completely odious, but the most draconian piece is Part B, which essentially says, yes, we know you're married, we know your state has married you, but you alone, because you're a boy-boy couple or a girl-girl couple, are not going to receive the same federal benefits and recognition that boy-girl couples get. I mean, it is absurd. I mean, talk about a quintessential denial of equal protection under the law. So that's the way the judge saw it in Boston, and now that case goes up on appeal. A very strong case. Then, not once, but twice, Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been struck down in the last 6 months. Now, obviously, in the wake of Tuesday's elections, you know, who knows what's going to happen and how much longer Don't Ask, Don't Tell is going to live. But there is a growing population of courts understanding that Don't Ask, Don't Tell is plain and simple discrimination, and there's absolutely no justification for it. And then Von Walker in San Francisco striking down Prop 8. That case continuing to make its way up through the courts, hearing on Prop 8 before the Ninth Circuit on December 6th. We'll be live tweeting. You can follow us. So that'll be really fascinating to see what happens with Prop 8. And then another U.S. Supreme Court case that NCLR was involved in. We won at the U.S. Supreme Court in June. So I'm happy to point out we now have a 100% winning record in our cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. You can pick up some of these brochures, and if we don't have enough, we're happy to send them to you. And I know you can't read it from where you're seated, but what it is it's anatomy of a case. And what we've always wanted to do as a legal organization, because obviously not all of our donors and supporters are lawyers, and we don't think you have to be a lawyer to understand the work that we do and why it's transformative. So what we tried to do in very simple language was explain why we do what we do, why we are a legal organization, why we see the law as a really effective agent for social change and liberation and justice for our community. This case A little bit complicated, I'll boil it down really simply. Christian Legal Society, they have chapters. They're the bad kind of Christians. They're very anti-gay, virulently, pretty much anti-anybody who doesn't have their very literalist view of Christianity and the Bible. They have chapters all over the country. They demand to be recognized as a formal student group on college campuses and law school campuses. And they did this with Hastings Law School in San Francisco. Demanded to be recognized as a formal student group. That means they get money from the student fees paid by students at Hastings to be recognized as a student group. Hastings said, no, we're not going to do that unless you agree to comply with our non-discrimination policy. Hastings, like many, many law schools, has a non-discrimination policy that says student groups cannot discriminate based on race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin. You know, non-discrimination laws, we think in this country, are a good thing. They're the model by which we think civic behavior should be regulated. And Christian Legal Society said, well, no, we're not going to comply with that non-discrimination policy. We're still going to discriminate against Jewish students and other non-Christians, and we're still going to discriminate against LGBT students, and we still want to be recognized as a formal student group. Hastings said, well, then, no, we're not going to recognize you. Unlike other law schools around the country who capitulated to this demand by Christian Legal Society, and so CLS sued Hastings Law School. And we got involved representing the LGBT student group at Hastings. And the reason this case is so important is not because we won, because that obviously is important and has ramifications I'll talk about in 1 second, but because the case is a perfect illustration of what I think a good legal organization and a good legal advocacy organization should do well. And it's what we do very well, particularly with our brilliant legal director, Shannon Minter. We knew there were many organizations that did not want to get involved in this case. Because when you look at this case, it looks, at first blush, as a very simple dynamic of gays versus people of faith. Well, you know, in a contest like that, we're going to lose. And especially going up to this U.S. Supreme Court, we're going to lose if that's the paradigm. So Shannon Minter, our legal director, really spent a lot of time coming up with what would be a theory that could command 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court. And the theory he came up with was not that the burden is on Hastings to show that they're not discriminating against Christian Legal Society. That's the way they've always suggested these cases go, that by not being recognized as a formal student group, you're infringing on our religious beliefs as Christian Legal Society. Shannon's analysis flipped that on its head. And instead, it's no, that's not the burden at all. The burden should be on Christian Legal Society to demonstrate why they, and they only, are entitled to an exemption from a non-discrimination policy that applies to everybody else equally, regardless of their belief, perspective, or purpose. And we got those 5 votes. Justice Ginsburg authored the majority opinion, a 5-4 ruling, saying, adopting our theory entirely, and saying that a non-discrimination policy that is neutrally applied to everyone is fine to be enforced against everyone, and no one group is entitled to an exemption. Now, the reason this case is so important is beyond Christian Legal Society and Hastings Law School, because for 30 years, our far-right opponents have been developing a very purposeful and intentional strategy to pit religious belief against the gays, knowing that if that's the dynamic, we're going to lose every time. Even though we have people of faith among us, even though there are multiplicities of faiths represented in the LGBT community, we knew that if that's the dynamic and paradigm that gets put forward, we're going to lose. And by losing, we threaten the very existence of non-discrimination statutes and policies all over the country. Well, that pillar of strategy put forward by the right and developed for 30 years is now completely eviscerated. And that is one reason why it's great to be a lawyer when you get wins like this and you can see the ripple effect. So that's the impact of, I think, a lot of the work that we do at NCLR. Yes, it's about a particular client, and yes, we obviously have tremendously important relationships with our clients. They become like family, many of them. We understand that they're in crisis, because if you're coming to us for assistance based on an employment issue, a family issue, a relationship issue, or government discrimination, you're not in a good place. There has been some trauma. And so, of course, we take seriously our representation of our clients. But when we win, because what we really try and take are cases that have a broader impact and have that ripple effect, so that we don't have to do this one by one by one, but we get a law changed in a state and then no one else ever has to suffer in the same way that our client did. When we win, it has that catalyzing effect that jumps the whole issue forward. The final thing that I want to say before obviously having this be a conversation and taking any questions is a little bit about, you know, where I think we are now in the wake of Tuesday, which definitely did change some things. Part of the reason that NCLR does the work that we do on behalf of on youth and immigration is not only that we recognize that our community is everywhere and in all sorts of different populations, but because we really do have a commitment to a broad frame of social justice change. Mandy Carter, a colleague of mine years ago, said, "It's not justice if it's about just us." And so the work that we do really recognizes that racism is still alive and well, classism is still alive and well, sexism is still alive and well, and those are every bit as toxic to LGBT people, regardless of our race or economic status, as homophobia or gender identity phobia. And so that work that we do is about trying to raise that larger narrative that we really are all in this together. So when I look at the results of the election on Tuesday, I particularly am concerned about the most worrying signs to me are two. First of all, what happened in Iowa. I think folks have probably read that the 3 justices who voted in favor of marriage equality were turned out of office in retention elections. Retention elections are just a yes or no. I mean, it's almost unheard of that a justice loses a retention election. And there's no one ever fights over them. The judges don't lobby, they're not out with ads, and there's usually no opposition. But our opponents, you know, well-funded anti-gay organizations opposed to marriage equality, poured over $1 million into Iowa, and these 3 justices were, you know, essentially sitting ducks. They didn't expend any money on their own behalf. Frankly, I think that many in our community were asleep at the wheel in not understanding the nature of the threat and responding in kind. I mean, we're going to have to play in a way we haven't had to play before. But the fact that they were turned out concerns me, not just for Iowa, although the legislature still stands strong and the Senate Majority Leader has said there's no way we're going to bring up an anti-marriage ballot measure as long as I'm in charge of the Senate here, and we hope that'll go on for a long time. But it's the chilling effect it may have for other justices who want to do the right thing, but may feel like they're choosing between doing the right thing and my job, doing the right thing or my career. And that is a Hobson's choice that justices should not be faced with. An independent judiciary is absolutely essential as this 3rd branch of government that is a check on legislative and the administrative branches. So I feel like we need to send the entire country back to 6th grade civics to understand what the branches of government do and what the purposes are, and that it's only a matter of time before the tables get turned. Right now, the National Organization for Marriage is gleefully celebrating that they turned out those 3 justices. But just as quickly, the tables could be turned against anti-gay forces who don't like something that is done against them, or something that's done in favor of us, and then we end up fighting and contesting over the one branch of government that should remain independent. So I worry about the future of the courts in a system where we treat judicial elections in the same way we do elections to a state house or to the Senate or to the House. The second thing that I'm concerned about is what I think what everyone would be concerned about, and that is the change in the House. Although I have to say, it's not like we were getting a whole bunch of stuff through anyway, but obviously we had meetings, we had an open audience, we had friends that we could cajole, keep the pressure on, and it was hoped that at least in the last 2 years of an Obama administration, we would see Congress move on some of our issues. And now, obviously, it remains to be seen if we're going to see any progress on anything that we've really cared about. I was talking to some folks earlier. One thing that I think is a little bit of a wild card, even for the Republicans, is what's going to happen with the Tea Party folks in Congress. And there are quite a little group of them, because these are not traditional social conservatives in the mold of far-right Republicans. These are folks who are the kind of classic libertarian model. You know, I think of them, and this would be really good if they're like this, I think of them a little bit like Ted Olson. You know, Ted Olson is this lion of the conservative right, and yet now he's a huge champion for marriage equality, leading the challenge to Prop 8. But he, you know, he definitely is a libertarian. Smaller government, thinks the government shouldn't do as much as it's doing. And whether you agree or disagree with that philosophy, social issues are not what drive a libertarian philosophy. And so it could be that could be a little bit of a fly in the ointment to social conservatives moving anti-gay stuff through Congress. We may see nothing really gay happening in Congress, anti or pro, for some period of time. But the silver lining, and I'll end with this because I always want to end on a positive note, is that the work that, that we are doing at NCLR currently and have been actually doing for about the last year has really been focused on kind of a workaround around Congress. We're not a congressional lobbying organization, although we've done a tremendous amount of work on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act and trying to get in-district visits with members of Congress to move the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. But where we're going to focus our attention is agency changes. Working with the Bureau of Prisons, Health and Human Services, Social Security Administration, Department of Education. You know, one thing about being around as long as I have, and I'm one of the longest tenured executive directors in the LGBT movement, which I guess just shows insanity at its highest peak, is that I know a lot of people in these agencies because they're colleagues that I've worked with at other organizations. So we have relationships with folks, and without any intervention of Congress, we don't need the president to sign anything, we can get changes at these agencies that improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of LGBT people. So that's the work that we're going to be focusing on work in the states where we do have positive developments in state legislatures. We did get some good pickups in state houses where there's really some great work to be done, and some state organizations that we're going to be partnering with to move small measures forward that can make a huge difference in the lives of LGBT people there. And New York, I mean, two bright spots out of Tuesday's elections were California and New York. And I'm really excited for what I think you're going to be able to do here to protect and advance family issues here and relationship issues and protections for LGBT folks here in New York. And you know, what we really want to create is the sort of world where no matter where you are, I mean, we always know there are going to be people who are living in pockets of the country where there is less safety, less security, less ability to feel like you can live a fully integrated life as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person. But what I really want to end is this spate of suicides that we saw over the last 3 months, where because there is an enormous disconnect between all these terrific gains that we've seen and this unprecedented visibility of LGBT people, positive depictions, headlines in any newspaper you want to pick up around the country about gains that we've made and role models that we can look to, and yet still kids feeling completely alone and isolated and in such pain that they don't even want to wake up the next morning. Bridging that disconnect, ending that gulf, and making those kids feel that they have a future and there are folks fighting for them is really why we do our work every day the way we do. So thanks so much for being here, and thanks for letting me talk about it. And I'd be happy to have a conversation or answer any questions if I can. Yeah.
So when When the whole Prop 8 thing on marriage gets to the Supreme Court, what do you see as a scenario, and what hook are you going to use for that one?
You know, that the Prop 8, the challenge to Prop 8 has been one of the most fascinating things to observe in my career. I think Ted Olson and David Boies being involved in the challenge to Prop 8 has been a complete game changer. They have totally changed the conversation, and they have muted a lot of the previous, much more loud Republican opposition to marriage. Because Ted Olson is like friends with these folks. They golf together, they go to each other's weddings, the multiple weddings they go to of each other. And they just have entirely changed the discourse and conversation. And that is really worth something, especially when we're talking about a multi-year fight before we get to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's the first observation. And I also think Ted Olson is one of the most eloquent spokespeople on this issue that I've ever seen. I mean, he just dang near brings me to tears every time I see him talk about it. The other thing is that it's taking some very unusual legal twists. So the hearing on December 6th, I mean, obviously we won at the trial court level. And anybody here read the Prop 8 ruling? You're so good, Gwen. You get the gold star. You guys get the gold star. I would suggest reading it, because you don't have to be a lawyer to appreciate its affirmation of fundamental humanity and civility and human rights. It really is a masterwork. And the thing that it also demonstrates, and after watching the trial, and it was so great to have this trial be in San Francisco and be able to see so much of it, is that our opposition all had no cattle. I mean, they had nothing. They had their best opportunity to present the most persuasive case possible for why it is in the state's interest to prohibit same-sex couples from marrying, and they got nothing. Nothing. And in fact, their star witness, we ended up using, because he was asked by David Boies, what will the nation be like? What do you think what our country will be like if we were to permit same-sex couples to marry? His answer, now keep in mind, he's there, witness. His answer, on that day, we will be more American. I don't know exactly what he meant, but I'm assuming he thinks being more American is a good thing. And so you can see why they ended up not putting any of that testimony on. They ended up deciding not to call him as a witness. This was his deposition testimony. So we presented it by videotape before the court. In all my years, 22 now, of being a lawyer, I have never seen the other side use the other side's witness to bolster their case. So not only did they not have anything, but what they had was in our favor. So it's fabulous to read the ruling, to just be so affirmed in the rightness of our position. Because oftentimes we have to have these conversations where you really, and I think it's important to have these conversations where we always are saying, we're always speaking to folks who are feeling more distant from support, who are struggling with support of LGBT issues. We always have to be open to those conversations. But it's so fun to read a ruling where their arguments are so utterly eviscerated. So, that said, we're now on appeal before the Ninth Circuit on this totally pinhead lawyer issue of standing, whether the proponents of Prop 8 actually have the legal right to be the ones defending Prop 8. Because the normal course of it is, this is now a state law, right? It's a part of the California Constitution. Who defends state laws? The governor, the attorney general of the state that has to enforce and enact and support the law. The proponents, they're done. They got it on the ballot. They got what they wanted. They don't have any responsibility for the execution of the law. And so there is fairly strong Supreme Court language that says proponents of a measure, because they're not the state, do not have standing, that is the ability to be in court as a party, to defend Prop 8. So the hearing on the 6th of December is going to be fabulously interesting on this issue that only 5 lawyers in the whole nation care about, and that is whether standing law will be used to decide the Prop 8 case. So it is theoretically possible that the Ninth Circuit could say proponents do not have standing, so then there's no one left to defend Prop 8, because both the governor, Schwarzenegger, and the Attorney General Brown, who's now the governor, said, I know, it was just musical chairs in California. You know? If you blink, they'll just be in a different political office. Are not going to defend Prop 8. So no one's left to defend it. It's dead. Now that standing ruling could then get appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And because of the politics on the court, I could easily see the U.S. Supreme Court, even though we have folks on the court who may or may not be sympathetic to invalidating Prop 8, I could certainly see the court saying, we are not even going to touch this. Fine. It's Prop 8, it's dead, go ahead and get married in California. So we could see Prop 8 die a quick but very well-deserved death sooner rather than later on this issue of standing. If it ends up going all the way up on the merits, let's say we lose on standing at some level, and it ends up going up on the merits, you're talking 3 years, which is a lifetime when it comes to this issue. And my best guess is I think we could command 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court for the proposition, not that all 32 state laws are invalidated under the Constitution, although that's certainly Ted Olson and David Boies' assessment, so I don't want to take too much issue with that. But I think we certainly could have 5 votes that Prop 8 is unconstitutional, because here it was recognized as a fundamental right to marry same-sex couples under the California Constitution, and then eliminated by popular vote. Something we just have not done. We didn't put women's suffrage up to a popular vote. We didn't put the end of anti-miscegenation laws in Loving versus Virginia up to a popular vote. And does anyone doubt that if we put those issues up to a popular vote, given the passion of the time in which those issues were decided, that those rulings would have been upheld? No, they wouldn't have been upheld. So I think there's a possibility that we could win on Prop 8, and while California does not in any way rule the nation, of course, New York does that, it will obviously have an enormous ripple effect. Go ahead.
I have a Ted Olson question and a Justice Scalia question. My Ted Olson question is, has he been on the record as saying that if the Prop 8 case actually ends early on account of standing, he will stay with this and take on another case and or just abandon the cause even if he believes it? That's my Ted Olson question. My Justice Scalia question is, in was it the Lawrence versus Texas case? I think it was that case where in his footnote he said, I have to vote against this ruling because by logical extension of this reasoning, it would absolutely lead to a ruling that you have to, he doesn't say marriage equality, but whatever he said is you have to recognize marriage equality. So surely a man of principle such as Justice Scalia would have to stand by his own reasoning in his footnote.
Do I need to repeat those questions? Okay, good. I love technology. Good questions. So Ted Olson first. Ted Olson is not on the record that I've seen saying that if Prop 8 were to be resolved within the next few months on standing, that he would or would not continue another fight. I suspect he will, though. I'm not sure what it would be, but the American Foundation for Equal Rights, which is funding the lawsuits and paying the Olson boys legal team and both of their law firms, are raising money. And I think they're raising money not just for this continual fight, but I think they're raising money because they're probably looking around, Olson and boys, for where would be the next case that could have that effect that could really move the issue forward. I actually think they're really in it for the long haul. And I think one of the things that they could really do is perhaps fold in a communications role. I mean, the strategic communications, Iowa may need it. We may need it in Minnesota. The Minnesota legislature has flipped, and they're talking about an anti-gay ballot measure. So I think, this is a moment where it's kind of an all hands on deck, and there's plenty of work to be done. And the folks involved with the American Foundation for Equal Rights and Ted Olson and David Boies, I have a lot of respect for, and I think they're brilliant. I think they've got more up their sleeve. I don't know exactly what it is. Now, with regard to Scalia, the footnote that you're talking about was in Lawrence versus Texas, and what he essentially said is, look, if you don't make them criminals based on their sexual behavior, what stops us, or what bulwark is there to still prohibit marriage if we're not going to criminalize their sexual intimacy? And he meant it, I think, as a rhetorical question, but in this moment we're like, yeah, why? I mean, what is there? It's, you know, there is, he's absolutely right. If there's nothing that says under the criminal law that we are less than, or that our relationships are in any way a threat, or are in any way dehumanized, or second class, what possible justification could there be for continuing to exclude same-sex couples from the right to marry? So I think whether Scalia will have the intellectual honesty to say, you know, I told you so, and I tried to warn you, but you did it anyway, and so now it's a fait accompli and there's no other place for me to go, it remains to be seen. But what I can guarantee you is that in any marriage ruling, those words will be quoted by some justice for sure, and so it'll be interesting to see. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Jill?
Hey, can you talk a little bit about some of the anti-bullying work that you have done with the youth project, a little bit just in light of all the stuff that has arisen? Just talk about some of the current stuff that NCLR is doing.
Yeah, you know, you kind of, I have to say, I mean, I think our entire community, you know, was shaken to our collective core by the rash of suicides. Because I really thought, you know, that things were better. You know, that things had gotten better, that it wasn't just, oh yeah, hang on and it'll get better. Our experience was that it really was getting better. I mean, there were like 13,000 gay-straight alliances, which was non-existent. No one even thought of those things 15 years ago. There's a level of visibility, you know, Jane Lynch, Ellen John. I mean, you know, there's actually, you know, you see positive depictions. I never saw that when I was growing up. I mean, I remember thinking, well, we must be sick because no one ever says anything good about us. And now, you know, if you're the slightest bit aware, you recognize that at least there's a contest, and there are huge allies that we have, and organizations really fighting for equality for LGBT people. There are religious leaders that are speaking out. And so you kind of think that trickles down, and that makes it better for everyone. And we've done a lot of schools work, and we've seen very significant improvements. You know, teachers putting up stickers that say this is a safe zone. And so it really, I think, made us realize that we were being too cavalier about how much we think has been accomplished. And so the work that we've been doing in our youth project has been focused largely on youth in foster care and juvenile justice systems, which are overly represented by, both those systems, overly represented by LGBT youth, and those populations overly represented by youth of color. And obviously, both those systems are in crisis and need to be paid attention to. But what we recognized is that I think there's been a little bit of a leapfrogging over kids in schools in, you know, all throughout America, not feeling safe in their communities. So what we are now partnering with both the Department of Education and a whole range of organizations, GLSEN, PFLAG, to really provide significant resources. I mean, I'm sure everyone's seen Dan Savage's project, It Gets Better video project. Well, now there's a whole lot of other projects piggybacking on that, saying not just it gets better, but here's how we're making it better, and here are people in your community that are making it better. So a whole series of videos being created, and resource materials being created and provided to schools and to sympathetic districts, school districts, and teachers and community leaders to provide resources right now where people are really marshaling, okay, here are good religious, here are safe religious places you can go, here are community organizations you can contact. I think people have kind of gone back and realized we actually still need to be doing more of this work than we thought. And so what's been great about it is everyone's had this all hands on deck moment of, okay, let's, you know, everyone's still going to keep doing a lot of the work we have doing because in many urban centers, youth are farther along and don't have to face these issues, but we can't have a death toll like that and not respond. Yeah.
What do you see as the opportunities for companies like CBS, I'm with NBC, these companies have strong gay, lesbian, transgender populations and employee groups that are able to sort of sway the company to get involved. What do you see as the opportunities for these companies to get involved and use their impact, name, clout?
Everything you've just talked about, and then like more of it. I mean, I think that one thing that you should never take for granted, and it may be that, you know, being in New York and lots of different organizations, it could sort of get lost that this is important. Seeing your name as a sponsor of an event, seeing your name as an underwriter of a project, seeing your employee groups as like a collectively making donations to certain groups. There's just a way in which, I mean, I really feel like we're not, you know, when you think of the tipping point, you think you hit this thing and then all of a sudden it's a downhill slide the whole way to the finish line. I think we are at this elongated tipping point when it comes to LGBT issues. I mean, we made this huge climb, and now we're kind of on this plateau where, you know, we can't really tell the things have tipped yet, but I think there's no doubt that we are at that point. And one of the reasons is because it's not just LGBT people or LGBT organizations who are seen as at the vanguard of civil rights protection for equality and justice and security for LGBT people. It's corporations, it's employee groups, it's individuals who don't make a living doing LGBT advocacy, but who stand up and who advocate in their communities. I mean, I think there is a way in which that echo chamber that gets created. So it could be everything from blogging to a newsletter that your affinity group creates, to continuing to have your name out there in sponsoring organizations that do good work, or even looking at, I mean, and speaking of the bullying thing, I think one of the things that's been so powerful about the It Gets Better project is how you see all these messages from unlikely allies. And so you as an affinity group could decide, okay, is there a school that we're going to particularly look at, or is there a message that we're going to particularly get out and create something that then can be used by a school, by a good teacher, by a group. I mean, it's only limited by your imagination. And having you out there, NBC, CBS, other corporations, is what helps create a climate where others who might be more reluctant then sign on, because it just seems so like that's the way we should be going, and that's the way we're headed.
What about specifically on the bullying topic? I know New York Times just had a great educational event. Google and Facebook put out It Gets Better video. What are some other ways, some other things you've seen companies do to help with this specific issue, or what ideas would you have for companies that want to help with this issue?
There's a resource packet that GLSEN is putting together. Gay Lesbian Straight Education Network is putting together a resource packet. I was just talking to someone, CBST. Does that make any sense to anybody? CBST?
Congregation.
Yes.
Okay, got it, thank you. They are putting together a resource packet with GLSEN that is sort of a how-to for corporations and community groups who want to adopt a school, adopt a congregation, to have this be a part of a curriculum piece. I will give you my card after and put you in touch with them, because I think that might be exactly, you might be able to plug directly into what they're doing.
Yeah, that person from Congregation Bates and Patora, who I
Yes.
think you were talking to last night, was making the point, I think, that you were also alluding to. It's going to get better is a nice message, but if someone is an extremist now, it may just be too far off. So it's
Right.
There are local resources now in the community, such as your churches, your synagogues, your community center groups, who are available to help. And so that's the project that they're working on together with us.
And I think, so I can give you resources where you can plug in to pieces that other groups might be doing, where you can then become part of a bigger whole instead of just doing it yourself. Yes, Jim.
This isn't just a gay issue, but I'm very concerned about the Supreme Court ruling this summer that let the floodgates open on money, and I think that played a huge part in this election with your own example of the three justices who were turned out. And not to rehash a political thing that's been hashed 1,000 times, but the when the vote happened with Prop 8 in California, me and lots of people I know in New York gave thousands of dollars, you know, individually to all those desperate cries, more money will help, and then it didn't help. So how do you, when you're outspent 100 to 1 in some races, how I realize tainting, you know, legal races with money is a whole other subject, but how do you know what to do with your money? I mean, obviously I'm going to support your group and tell
That's a
other
good
people.
choice.
Jill already told me that. But you know, how do you know what to do with your money, especially when it comes to political races, when, you know, now corporations are in groups. It's come out now that all those groups, Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, and that's the nicest one, were behind all these
Yep.
very, very outspent people. So how do you deal with that with your own money? What do you do with your own money?
Well, I do think that the Citizens United ruling, I mean, one thing that I'm very concerned about with the House flipping is there'll be no chance now legislatively to undo Citizens United, which I think is, we're going to have to live with the consequences of that for a long time, and it's not going to be pretty. I do think that there are when I think about my giving, there are two ways that I think one should give. I would give to established organizations whose mission or track record, whose mission appeals to you, and whose track record demonstrates some success. And then you can go to things like, what's the rating for nonprofits? You know, the web Charity Navigator, someplace like that where you can just make sure that, you know, the percentages of what they spend on program versus what they spend on overhead, you know, all those kind of natural due diligence things. So giving to established organizations, I think, is essential, because those are the folks who will be there year in and year out, whether it's, you know, I sort of pick local, state, national, so you kind of have the whole waterfront covered geographically. But I also feel like everyone should have this sort of emergency fund for things that come up that are just unexpected, but we just can't sit out the fight. I think Prop 8 was one of those fights. I mean, I think that money, yes, we didn't win, but we came closer than any measure ever has before. In Maine, they spent every bit as, and in California, you know, keep in mind, you're talking about 13 million registered voters in a state of 30 million people, and the turnout was about 8 million. The money spent per voter was less than almost any other anti-gay measure. Oregon spent twice as much as we did in California and lost by even more. Maine didn't spend as much, and it was the same percentage, lost by the same percentage. We're just kind of stuck at that 52-48, although it looks like it's starting to change a little bit when you look at some of the national polls. So part of it's just going to have to be time, but we have to fight. I mean, there are lots of people who say, gosh, we just shouldn't have fought at all, and, you know, it would have ended up the same. But we can't be absent from the narrative and the dialogue and the discourse. So key fights, and you can look to organizations that you trust. I mean, if people had asked us about giving money to Iowa, we would have absolutely been, yes, you should be giving money to help one Iowa defend these justices. So by giving to organizations, you can then use those organizations for when the emergency fights come up to say, hey, is this something I should be putting my money at? Or if you get an email from an organization that you trust saying, look, this is a really important, I mean, we don't do political endorsements, so we don't do individual candidate fights, but, you know, if you get an email from us, you trust us, you've supported us, you're investing in us, and we say, look, this is an issue that we really need an all-hands-on-deck moment for. I mean, unfortunately, money is how we're going to win or lose many of these issue fights moving forward. And I think I think the thing that's so tragic about it is, while I don't think Prop 8 was winnable by any amount of money in terms of how the vote ended up, I think we could have saved those justices in Iowa if there would have been a response. But people were so not used to having to fight in a retention election, because justices always win those, that once again we were behind the curve, and our opponents saw it early, took advantage of it, and we were pretty much sitting on the couch while they were, at the finish line.
Yeah. What kind of voter turnout was there in Iowa? Like, was it a very low percentage that?
I think it was actually pretty high. I mean, I think it was higher than average, but I should double check. I remember just seeing a flash of it.
Just because people weren't paying attention, so the people that were against the justices were able to rule, or?
I think people did not, most people who would have voted the right way either didn't vote down ballot. That's a huge problem with people just, sort of voting on the first side of the ballot and not turning it over. There are a lot of people who probably never even vote in retention elections because who pays attention to those? So voting down ballot really important. There's going to have to be some analysis to figure out, okay, did we lose just because they spent more and were more strategic about it? Could we have won if we had been out front and matched them message for message? I don't know really what the answer is, but I think turnout was pretty strong. And it was pretty strong in most states, actually, I think. And I think for both sides. I mean, in California, turnout was really high for a midterm, and that certainly helped progressive candidates. I think in other states, not so much.
I was just going to add that one of the things, I think a way to think about the money that you spend even in these emergency situations is it really is an investment, because what you're allowing to do is you're really strengthening the kind of grassroots organizing capability of our community around a particular issue.
Yep.
And you can absolutely look back at abortion rights fights and see where there were ballot initiatives, and where there were actually, like in Iowa, there was an ERA campaign in '92, and that really laid a lot of the groundwork for what we were able to do in Iowa. I mean, it's absolutely building on each thing. So even though, we didn't unfortunately win relative to Prop 8, we've become a lot smarter about that, and I think we are still sort of building the community and our skills and expertise around fighting battles like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's so important because, I mean, look, who doesn't love instant gratification, right? And yet, when you're in the midst of a civil rights struggle, you really have to take the long view. I mean, it's why they call it a struggle and not a play date. It's like you have to think of it in terms of generation after generation. And unfortunately, our opponents have done that actually better than we have. If we don't get a result right away, we're like, okay, well, screw them, And we just have to have a longer view and an understanding that the strategy takes a while to unfold. And even though the loss on Prop 8 has made many people bitter about giving to campaigns, Equality California has 300,000 more names of identified likely voters in its database than they would have without Prop 8. And those names, I had a huge amount to do with why Jerry Brown is governor, why Gavin Newsom is lieutenant governor, and why Kamala Harris, who used to be district attorney in San Francisco, is hanging on to be the AG by 3,000 votes. It's that close. Now, Kamala Harris winning in California would be amazing because she has such a progressive view of criminal justice, and she will really do some terrific things around juvenile justice and criminal justice, and where she can, LGBT issues. So, that investment in Prop 8 didn't defeat Prop 8, but it may have made it possible for us to have one of the most progressive attorneys general and one of the first women and the first African American woman ever in the state of California. And that is going to be huge for all the issues we care about. Yes?
Are there more discussions now within national LGBT organizations for how to reach out to communities of color? I feel that if we had reached out, and I'll blame myself, I mean, I should be bridged. If we had reached out, I think that we probably could have defeated property. I think there are a lot of people in the Latino community and the African American community who see the LGBT organizations and say that's for white people.
Yep.
and there's no connection. They don't feel like it's necessarily a battle.
Yeah, no, I think that's really right. I think that the sense that people have that the LGBT movement is white, middle class, mostly lives in big cities. You know, I mean, that might be great for, you know, a sitcom episode, but it's not real life, and it doesn't do our community any favors. I mean, we are everywhere, and huge numbers of us are working class or working poor, of color, living in families, in communities, living in rural areas and suburban areas, and we do not do a very good job of making those connections. And I think part of it is because, I mean, I think a lot of folks that I know who are white and LGBT feel like that's just enough to sort of have to deal with, and they're very careful about being out. They're very worried about what people are going to think about their sexual orientation if they know. And so many people that I know in the LGBT community have this passing privilege based on not appearing to be lesbian or gay. And so the passing is this double-edged sword, because on one hand it may protect them from overt discrimination, but it does nothing to help activate them or make them activists or make them understand what it's like to not be able to move in the world with passing privilege based on race or gender or sexual orientation. So I think we have to have in the LGBT community a much more honest and sustained conversation about how race operates in the movement, how it operates in the broader culture, and how our fate is completely tied to the fate of people of color, both LGBT and not, in terms of what kind of country we're going to be. And I think we reach out to communities of color when we need communities of color to show up for us on a particular issue. And we're not the ones who are showing up on issues that affect communities of color, whether it's immigration. There are lots of LGBT folks who do not see immigration as an LGBT issue, who don't care about that issue, and who don't show up and speak out about how draconian our immigration policy is in this country, who don't speak out about racism and particularly what's been happening with Obama and some of the overt racism going on, because they're just in their own silos. So I think part of it is, yes, reaching out to say, look, being willing to have conversations and reaching out to communities of color about LGBT issues is enormously important, but also the way you pave the way for that conversation is when communities of color in the local community where you live, whether it's your African American church or whether it's community centers, see you as a white person showing up on issues that matter to the community of color that is predominant in the place where you live. So I think we have to reach out, but we have to be reaching out all the time. It can't just be, oh yeah, I want to change your mind about this one issue.
I think, yes, I think that's important, but I think the organizations also, LGBT organizations, need to do something about making people feel comfortable when we go into those spaces. Because I can tell you that's not always the case. And now I'm sounding hostile.
No, I completely agree.
Hungry and joy. Okay, so that's both.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree, and part of it is because many people of color, LGBT or not, walk into a room of LGBT movement leaders and everybody's white.
Right. Yes.
And so when you don't see yourself reflected at the table, it does not feel like a very welcoming space. And then when you don't see your issues talked about, people don't seem to get it, they don't seem to care, they don't seem to understand. So I completely agree. And one good news, I mean, there are several pieces of good news that I think are helping to change both, not just the sort of a gestalt and the perspective of the movement, but also the face of the movement. There's our projects that NCLR is a part of, and thankfully we're not the only one, about 40 national LGBT organizations called the Pipeline Project, participating in elevating our staff of color to leadership positions so that they're the ones that you will see at those tables when you go to meetings involving organizations talking about LGBT issues. It's recognized as a huge problem. Part of the problem has been is people haven't been willing to move out of the way and make way for other leadership. And I think that is finally happening in organizations. So I'm hoping that you'll begin to see some changes, because it's one thing to talk the talk, but if you don't walk the talk, it's not going to make a difference.
It's necessary for our survival. I mean, the country's changing, America's getting violent.
Absolutely.
We don't reach out.
California is already, as they say in the, lingo, majority minority, and it's what is it, 2016 before the entire country will be majority people of color. And hello, we have really got to be having a conversation that doesn't put whiteness and white supremacy at the center of power and the people who control things. I agree. Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe a little off topic, but it's something that concerns me and a lot of people that I know. And it's the tax penalty that gay and lesbian couples or families find out about when they go to put their partner on their health insurance.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is that something that is going to stick around until marriage equality, or is there anything in the works to try to work on that issue?
It's a hard issue to work on an ad hoc basis, because the IRS is just so insanely bureaucratic. We've had discussions. I mean, there are some good folks at the IRS who are LGBT identified and realize that that's a problem and want to do something about it. But it's so difficult to change that without marital status being available to LGBT couples. So obviously, I think we can continue to make an advocacy push on an ad hoc basis. I actually don't think it's going to happen until couples are recognized as married by the federal government. But this could all happen, this could all happen in a fairly short amount of time. If Part B of DOMA is struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think that case will be to the U.S. Supreme Court within the next 2, the outside 3 years, it's not a marriage case. So it doesn't really involve the M word. It is a recognition case. These couples are already married. Yes, Justice Scalia, you might not have married them, but they got married in that wacky state of Massachusetts, and now they are here with claims that their relationship should be recognized just like anybody else's by the federal government. I think that is a case very well played by GLAAD that is going to get 5 votes. So once DOMA is struck down, then you've got a whole bunch of couples now who are avoiding the marriage penalty or avoiding that penalty on health care because they're married. And this is all a house of cards, right? So as soon as you sort of knock out that card, it's only going to be a matter of time before there's going to have to be some sort of recognition that couples in marriage-like relationships, where they take on all the same burdens as marriage, but it's just called civil union because states are still freaked out about having it be marriage, also have to be recognized for federal purposes. So I think the next 5 years, hopefully I'll be back in 5 years and we can talk again and we'll see whether it's true. The movement will be much more open, and there'll be much more leadership of color in the movement, where we're going to do that, and we're going to get rid of this. And I think in the next 5 years, there's going to be a sea change. Notwithstanding, even with what happened on Tuesday, I think a lot of things are going to happen that Congress is just not going to be a part of. So, yeah, it's nothing right away, but within your lifetime for sure. How's that? Yeah.
So if DOMA gets struck down, there will also be immigration benefits. Like, will all federal benefits apply immediately?
It should. Yep.
So if I'm in New York, never decides to marry people, when I go to Massachusetts and get married, will I then be able to get all federal benefits? No?
I don't think so.
Tell me, Gwen.
I think the GLAAD case,
Yep.
as discussed by the executive director of that organization with me, because I was getting married in Massachusetts, she was quite upfront. We are taking it in small doses and increments, and that case is about people, Massachusetts residents, who are married in Massachusetts.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's right. It would apply to all the benefits, but only if you're married in that state. But you know what? New York is going to change.
But it's a house. But as you said, it's going to be a house of cards that falls. So I don't think anything's going to be automatic.
And I think you'll get marriage in New York before the court rules on DOMA.
Right. You still won't help a federal immigration issue.
Okay, so the federal
Yeah, that has to, I mean, all of DOMA has to be gotten rid of. So, yeah, but I.
But wait a minute, wait a minute. I
Yeah.
disagree slightly. I mean,
Okay.
I think if you're married, let's say New York legislatively passes and recognizes marriage. If you're married in New York and Part B of DOMA is struck down, that includes being able to sponsor your partner for immigration purposes.
Okay, I hope so.
I think
Okay.
that's right. I mean, you know, maybe some of this is still around the edges. I mean, obviously the fact that, you know, one lawyer is arguing with another lawyer. You know, how rare is that? That never happens. You know, obviously we can't be certain about any of this stuff.
Wait, so okay, so tell me what Part A, how does Part A?
Part A is state-to-state recognition.
Right, so, okay, so Part B strikes down the definition under federal law of marriage as a man and a woman.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it may be that there may need to be another step around immigration, and immigration is the one issue. I mean, it's a life or death issue in terms of the cases we're in, because the couples that we represent, not the couples, the individuals that we represent are mostly from the African continent, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, South America, and they have suffered excruciatingly appalling persecution in their home countries. And so winning asylum for them is really life or death. I mean, if they're deported, they will not survive. But immigration is this like most toxic intersection. You know, xenophobia, homophobia, sometimes, you know, sexism, transphobia. I mean, our clients are living right at that terrible intersection. So I worry a little bit about immigration, even if DOMA is struck down, just because we're so nuts when it comes to immigration. And I don't see that improving, especially after Tuesday's election. But that will be a huge area of advocacy once DOMA is struck down, because if that's the one thing that doesn't still apply, then I think you've got a whole other basis for a litigation and legal challenge. But it is I mean, we represent couples who live in the United States, did not get married, because you shouldn't be marrying if you're in a binational relationship, because it shows intent to stay. So it's not good for couples in binational relationships to marry. We encourage them not to marry because it shows an intent to overstay your visa. I mean, if you marry someone, it doesn't look like you're going to leave anytime soon, right? So we tell couples not to marry. But we've had couples get together, be together for years, have children together, and then one of them goes out of status and is deported. And there is nothing we were able to do. So immigration is some of the most heart-wrenching work that we do, but we're bound and determined to change it.
All right, I'm going to let you actually finish.
And I'm done.
And then this is, so I just want to thank Kate, Kendell, and my friends from NCLR. And thank all of you for showing up. There are materials out here if you want to learn more about NCLR, and if you want to sign up to get some more materials or information, you can do so. And if you want to stick around for a little bit to schmooze with Kate, I told her that I would take her out to dinner and fill her with alcohol amply, but she had to stay and talk to people. So thank you.
Which is not a burden, really.
I know, it's so horrible. But thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on a rainy, yucky night, especially our friends who come from outside of the CBS family, and from those who are gay and straight who are from within the CBS family. I think we had decent earnings today. I'm not sure, but so let's have a little party.
Thank